A suspect stands several feet in front of Robert F. Kennedy and fires an 8-shot revolver. Yet crime scene investigators count 13 bullet holes scattered across the victims and the walls. Even more impossibly, the fatal shot enters the back of Kennedy's head from exactly 1 inch away. Simple mathematics and cold ballistics prove the man they arrested did not act alone. Today we declassify the RFK assassination to expose the 13 bullets in an 8-shot gun and the invisible assassin the system tried to erase. But the reason behind this brazen erasure isn't found in the ballistics. It lies in the sheer magnitude of the threat Robert Kennedy had become. His death warrant wasn't signed in 1968. It was forged on November 22, 1963, when his brother, President John F. Kennedy, was murdered in Dallas. That bullet didn't just kill a president, it shattered Robert's ruthless pragmatism. The trauma fundamentally mutated his political DNA, replacing his iron-fisted enforcement with a dangerous, bleeding empathy for the marginalized. He was no longer just a politician playing the game. He was a grieving brother on an unstoppable crusade to dismantle the very state machinery he once helped operate. The system that governed America did not fear the grieving brother. They feared the awakening investigator. Within days of John's murder, Robert Kennedy knew the official narrative was a fabrication. He knew the intelligence apparatus, the anti-Castro exiles, and the mafia figures he had aggressively prosecuted had colluded in a bloody coup d'etat. He quietly dispatched his own trusted aides to investigate the assassination, bypassing the FBI and the newly formed Warren Commission, which he privately viewed as a masterclass in institutional obfuscation. He told his inner circle that the Warren Report was a public relations exercise designed to pacify the masses, not to uncover the truth. But he also knew he was powerless to expose it. As long as Lyndon B. Johnson held the presidency and J. Edgar Hoover controlled the FBI, Robert Kennedy was a man operating inside a hostile regime. He made a silent, strategic vow. He would endure the political wilderness, bide his time, and capture the ultimate seat of power, the presidency. Once in the Oval Office, with the full executive authority of the United States at his disposal, he would tear the Warren Commission to shreds. He would open the files. He would expose the men who murdered his brother, and the men in the shadows knew it. This silent vow transformed Robert Kennedy into a walking liability for the establishment. But as the 1960s progressed, his threat level escalated from a personal vendetta to a systemic crisis. The catalyst was Vietnam. Following JFK's death, the military-industrial complex was unleashed. The Vietnam War metastasized into a colossal blood-soaked enterprise, printing billions of dollars for defense contractors, aerospace engineers, and the banking cartels that financed the debt. It was a perfectly engineered perpetual war machine. Young working-class Americans were fed into the meat grinder of Southeast Asia, while the elite profited from the shrapnel. Robert Kennedy watched this escalation with growing horror. He had been part of the administration that sent the first advisors, but by 1967, his trauma-induced empathy could no longer tolerate the slaughter. He broke ranks. He stood on the floor of the Senate and delivered a blistering, uncompromising critique of the war, calling for a halt to the bombing and a negotiated settlement. By taking this stance, RFK crossed the ultimate red line. He wasn't just questioning foreign policy, He was threatening to turn off the financial tap of the most powerful corporate and military syndicate in human history. To the men who orchestrated the Cold War, Kennedy was no longer just a grieving brother seeking revenge. He was a radical who intended to dismantle the economic engine of the empire. The military intelligence apparatus, the CIA, and the defense contractors viewed him not as a political opponent, but as an existential threat to national security. Their version of national security, which depended on perpetual conflict and absolute control. As 1968 dawned, the United States was a nation coming apart at the seams. It was a year of fire, blood, and unprecedented polarization. The Tet Offensive destroyed the illusion that the Vietnam War was winnable. The assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. ignited race riots that burned through the inner cities of over 100 American municipalities. The air smelled of tear gas and burning buildings. The population was fractured, desperate, and yearning for a unifying figure. In this atmosphere of apocalyptic tension, Robert Kennedy announced his candidacy for the presidency of the United States. He stepped onto the campaign trail knowing exactly what it meant. He was not naive. He frequently discussed the likelihood of his own assassination with his closest aides. He knew the invisible forces that had butchered his brother in broad daylight would not hesitate to kill again. But his trauma had stripped him of fear. He possessed a fatalistic courage, driven by a moral imperative to heal the country and exact a righteous justice. His campaign was unlike anything the establishment had ever witnessed. It was not a calculated, poll-tested political operation. It was a visceral, emotional crusade. When he traveled through the impoverished regions of Appalachia, the Native American reservations of the Dakotas, or the burning ghettos of inner-city America, he connected with the disenfranchised on a molecular level. They looked into his eyes and saw a man who understood profound loss. He bridged the unbridgeable divide between white working-class laborers and radicalized black youth. He drew massive, frenzied crowds that tore at his clothes, desperate just to touch him. He was building an unstoppable coalition of the marginalized, a demographic tidal wave that terrified the power brokers. The elite watched in cold panic as Kennedy swept through the primaries. They realized that their preferred candidates, the establishment figures willing to maintain the status quo and keep the Vietnam War machine humming, could not defeat him at the ballot box. Kennedy was a runaway train, accelerating straight toward the White House. By the late spring of 1968, the invisible architecture of power reached a terrifying consensus. Robert Kennedy could not be allowed to win the California primary. California was the ultimate prize, the state that would guarantee him the Democratic nomination and propel him toward the presidency. The establishment had analyzed the trajectory. If he reached the Oval Office, he would immediately end the war, dismantle the CIA's rogue operations, and initiate the bloodiest purge of the intelligence community in American history to avenge his brother. He was untouchable through conventional political means. The media could not smear him effectively enough. The opposition could not out-campaign him. The system faced a critical override protocol. When the illusion of democracy fails to protect the interests of the deep state, the apparatus of violence is deployed. The machinery of his execution began to silently assemble in the shadows of Los Angeles, utilizing the darkest assets of Cold War intelligence, preparing a trap from which the senator could never escape. The evening of the 4th of June 1968 crackled with an electric, almost unbearable tension inside the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles. The California primary was not merely a political contest. It was the ultimate referendum on the soul of a bruised and bleeding nation. In his suite on the 5th floor, Robert Kennedy awaited the returns. He was physically emaciated, running on the fumes of sheer nervous energy and a deeply ingrained fatalism. The campaign had ravaged him. His hands were raw and bleeding from the desperate grips of the crowds. His voice was reduced to a raspy whisper. Yet, as the numbers rolled in, confirming a decisive victory over Eugene McCarthy, a profound sense of destiny settled over the room. He had done the impossible. He had successfully bypassed the entrenched political machine, taking his anti-war, anti-establishment crusade directly to the streets, and the streets had answered. As midnight approached, Kennedy prepared to descend to the embassy room to claim his victory. He believed for a fleeting moment that he had outmaneuvered the dark forces that had haunted his family for 5 years. He was wrong. Assassination at the highest levels of statecraft is not an impulsive act of rage. It is a masterclass in logistics, spatial geometry, and psychological manipulation. The system does not merely eliminate a target. It meticulously engineers the environment of the kill to ensure total control over the subsequent narrative. To understand the brutal efficiency of what happened next, one must understand the tactical vulnerability of the target. In 1968, presidential candidates were not afforded Secret Service protection. That protocol would only be instituted as a direct consequence of this very night. Robert Kennedy's security apparatus was a makeshift, dangerously porous shield. He relied on a handful of loyal former FBI agents, amateur volunteers, and private security contractors hired by the hotel. Among these private guards was a man named Thane Eugene Caesar, an employee of Ace Guard Service, who harbored deep vocal resentments toward the Kennedy family and their progressive politics. The establishment knew Kennedy's defensive perimeter was fundamentally compromised. They also knew his psychological profile. Kennedy's trauma-induced empathy made him reckless. He despised the barrier between himself and the public. He fed on the tactile connection of the crowd, plunging into seas of humanity despite the frantic warnings of his aides. The architects of his demise understood that they did not need to hunt him down with a sophisticated sniper team. They simply needed to guide him into a carefully constructed trap where his own instinct to engage with the public would be weaponized against him. At 12:15 a.m. on the 5th of June, Kennedy concluded his victory speech with the famous, optimistic directive, "So it's on to Chicago, and let's win there." He flashed a final weary smile, raised a V for victory sign, and turned away from the podium. This is the precise moment the invisible hand of the deep state intervened. The pre-planned, heavily scouted route to his next destination, a press conference in a different wing of the hotel, was supposed to take him directly through the open expanse of the ballroom. This route offered wide lines of sight, ample space for his aides to flank him, and a clear path of retreat. But as Kennedy stepped off the rostrum, his advance men were abruptly countermanded. Hotel management and private security personnel forcefully redirected the senator. They claimed the ballroom was too congested and insisted on a shortcut. They steered the next president of the United States away from the safety of the open floor and pushed him toward a set of swinging doors located behind the stage. Those doors led into the hotel's food preparation area. They were leading the lamb directly into the slaughterhouse. In military and tactical terminology, the space Robert Kennedy was forced to enter is known as a fatal funnel. A fatal funnel is a narrow, restrictive choke point, a doorway, a hallway, or an alley that strips a target of peripheral vision, eliminates any possibility of lateral movement, and forces them into a highly predictable, inescapable path. The kitchen pantry of the Ambassador Hotel was the ultimate fatal funnel. It was a suffocatingly cramped, brightly lit corridor flanked by massive industrial ice machines and stainless steel food warmers. The sensory environment inside the pantry was a weapon in itself. The temperature hovered near 100 degrees, thick with the smell of stale grease, sweat, and panic. The ambient noise was deafening. The roar of the cooling compressors, the clatter of dropped silverware, and the sudden, blinding flashes of aggressive press photographers who had rushed ahead to intercept him. By forcing Kennedy into this specific geometry, the orchestrators achieved total tactical supremacy. In a wide open space, an assassin risks being spotted before drawing a weapon. In the claustrophobic crush of the pantry, where bodies were pressed shoulder to shoulder, a weapon could be drawn and leveled without anyone noticing until the trigger was pulled. But the cruelty of the fatal funnel goes far beyond the mechanics of the ambush. The environment was deliberately chosen to serve as the foundation of the cover-up. The establishment required a crime scene that would immediately degenerate into absolute, unmanageable chaos. If a professional hit squad shoots a political leader from a rooftop, the assassination bears the undeniable signature of an orchestrated state execution, reminiscent of Dallas, which would risk tearing the fabric of American society apart. But if a prominent politician is gunned down in a sweaty, chaotic kitchen by a visibly foreign, ostensibly radicalized young man, the public is instantly provided with a neat, easily digestible narrative. The sheer panic of the crowd within the cramped pantry guaranteed that there would be 70 different eyewitnesses, and the sensory overload guaranteed that all 70 would provide contradictory accounts of what they saw. This orchestrated confusion is the lifeblood of a systemic cover-up. It allows the authorities to selectively cherry-pick witness statements that support the lone gunman narrative while burying or discrediting those that mention other shooters, fleeing suspects, or impossible ballistics. The pantry was not just an execution chamber. It was an evidentiary black hole designed to swallow the truth. As Kennedy moved deeper into the funnel, the crowd surged forward, crushing his security detail against the walls. He was effectively separated from his primary bodyguards. Right behind his right shoulder, gripping his arm to guide him through the crush, was the private security guard, Thane Eugene Caesar, his gun drawn and held downward. Kennedy, true to his fatalistic nature, did not rush. He stopped to shake hands with the kitchen staff, the very working-class people he had sworn to protect. He paused to greet a young, terrified busboy named Juan Romero. At that exact second, from the narrow space beside the humming ice machine, a 24-year-old Palestinian immigrant named Sirhan stepped out into the blinding glare of the television lights. He raised an Iver Johnson .22 caliber revolver, but Sirhan was not the mastermind. He was the bait. He was the loud, violent, tragic distraction positioned at the front of the stage. As the first sharp crack of gunfire echoed over the roar of the crowd, the true clinical brutality of the operation was set into motion. The trap had sprung, the fatal funnel had closed, and in the blinding flashes of the cameras, the history of the 20th century was violently rewritten. The crack of the .22 caliber revolver was not deafening, but in the tight, echoing confines of the Ambassador Hotel pantry, it sounded like a string of firecrackers detonating in a metal drum. Pandemonium erupted instantly. The crowd, a densely packed mass of reporters, kitchen staff, and campaign aides, shattered into absolute chaos. But as the screams tore through the sweltering air and men threw themselves to the grease-stained floor, a terrifying physical anomaly was occurring at the epicenter of the violence. Olympic decathlete Rafer Johnson, professional football player Rosie Greer, and journalist Boris Yarrow lunged at the shooter. They crashed into Sirhan, slamming him against the stainless steel serving counters, desperately twisting his wrist to pry the weapon from his grip. Sirhan possessed a slight, almost frail frame, yet it took the combined strength of several massive athletes to wrestle the gun away. His finger remained locked rigidly on the trigger, mechanically firing the remaining rounds into the ceiling and the crowd until the chamber clicked empty. But the true horror was not his unnatural strength, it was his face. Those who pinned him to the floor later testified to an image that would haunt them for decades. Sirhan's eyes were completely dilated, staring blankly ahead. His face was tranquil, devoid of fear, devoid of rage, and devoid of the adrenaline-fueled panic of an assassin who had just gunned down the next president of the United States. He was visibly, chillingly absent. When the Los Angeles Police Department dragged Sirhan into the interrogation room, they expected to find a fiercely motivated zealot. They expected a fanatic eager to claim responsibility, to shout his political manifesto, to proudly martyr himself for a cause. Instead, they found an empty vessel. As the detectives grilled him under the harsh fluorescent lights, demanding to know his motives, Sirhan shivered as if waking from a deep sleep. He looked at his hands, he looked at his interrogators, and he offered a response that he has maintained with unwavering consistency for over half a century. I do not remember. He did not know where he was. He did not know he had shot Robert Kennedy. He could not recall arriving at the hotel, walking into the pantry, or pulling the trigger. To the police and to a public desperate for a simple explanation, this sounded like the desperate, transparent lie of a man trying to escape the gas chamber. To those who study the dark history of Cold War intelligence, Sirhan's profound amnesia did not resemble a lie. To them, it looked like a terrifyingly successful diagnostic result and the hallmark of a programmed Manchurian candidate. To understand how a human being can be transformed into an amnesic weapon, we must look at the brutal, unredacted realities of the era. The 1950s and 1960s were the golden age of classified psychological warfare. The Central Intelligence Agency, terrified by the brainwashing techniques utilized by the Soviets and the Chinese during the Korean War, had initiated a massive, deeply illegal program known as MK Ultra. This was not Hollywood fiction. It is a matter of congressional record, exposed during the Church Committee hearings in the 1970s. The deep state recognized that the perfect assassin is not a trained sniper or a loyal soldier. because a soldier can be captured, interrogated, and broken. The perfect assassin is a man who does not know he is an assassin. He is a proxy who cannot betray his handlers because his conscious mind possesses no memory of the crime or the men who ordered it. The system demanded absolute, airtight, plausible deniability. If a programmed asset is caught, the public sees a lone deranged gunman while the invisible hand of the state remains entirely concealed. The methodology of MK was savage and systematic. The CIA contracted prominent psychiatrists operating out of prestigious universities and covert black sites to discover how to entirely overwrite the human psyche. They used massive doses of LSD, electroshock therapy, extreme sensory deprivation, and a technique called psychic driving, where a patient was forced to listen to looped audio messages for days on end while kept in a chemically induced coma. The objective was to artificially induce a state of dissociative identity disorder. The programmers learned that by applying relentless, unimaginable trauma to a human mind, that mind will naturally fracture into compartmentalized alters to survive the pain. Once the mind is fractured, a programmer can isolate one of those fragments, install a specific violent command, and seal it behind an amnesic barrier using deep hypnosis. The asset can then go about their normal life completely unaware of the sleeper personality lurking within them until a specific trigger, a phrase, a sound, a visual cue is activated. But you cannot program just anyone. You cannot take a mentally stable, well-adjusted individual and turn them into a Manchurian candidate overnight. The intelligence community needed subjects who were already broken, people whose psychological foundations were already cracked by trauma. Sirhan was the perfect raw material. Born in Jerusalem, he spent his early childhood surviving the horrors and bombings of the 1948 Arab-Israeli War. He witnessed a man torn apart by a bomb right in front of him. He was subjected to brutal, regular beatings by a violent, tyrannical father. When his family immigrated to the United States, settling in California, Sirhan was a deeply traumatized, alienated young man searching for an anchor. His vulnerability made him highly susceptible. He drifted into the fringes of esoteric spirituality, becoming deeply involved with the Rosicrucians, engaging in self-hypnosis, mirror gazing, and automatic writing. He was actively participating in the dissolution of his own conscious boundaries. He was standing on the edge of a psychological cliff, and the intelligence apparatus simply needed to give him a push. In the months leading up to the assassination, Sirhan's behavior became highly erratic. He disappeared for days at a time. He frequented firing ranges, standing for hours in trance-like states. He was seen at the Ambassador Hotel on the days preceding the murder, often accompanied by unknown individuals who appeared to be guiding him. And then there is the most damning piece of physical evidence the police used to condemn him: his notebooks. Found in his bedroom, the diaries were filled with pages of repetitive, chilling scribbles. RFK must die. RFK must be assassinated. RFK must be disposed of. The police presented this as the ultimate proof of premeditated malice. But psychiatric experts in the field of hypnoprogramming look at those notebooks and see something entirely different. The handwriting is fundamentally altered. The repetition is mechanical. It is the textbook physical manifestation of automatic writing, performed under a deep hypnotic trance. The notebooks were not the diary of a political fanatic. They were the practice logs of a mind being actively programmed, a manufactured motive left out in the open, neatly gift-wrapped for the LAPD to find. The tragedy of Sirhan Sirhan is that he was a victim of the very system Robert Kennedy was trying to dismantle. Sirhan was not the mastermind of the plot to kill the senator. His role was far more utilitarian and far more cruel. When he stepped out from beside that ice machine in the pantry, his mind locked in an artificially induced state of hyperfocus. His sole purpose was to be a decoy. He was a human flashbang grenade. The deep state knew that the presence of an armed, firing suspect at the front of the room would act as an irresistible magnet for the eyes of every reporter, bodyguard, and bystander in the fatal funnel. By orchestrating this loud, terrifying distraction, the true architects of the assassination bought themselves the critical seconds they needed. They needed the crowd to lunge forward, to tackle the puppet, to focus all their rage and attention on the dark-haired young man with the smoking gun. Because while the world watched the puppet, the puppeteer's true executioner was already moving in, stepping seamlessly into the blind spot just inches behind Robert F. Kennedy's head. The immediate aftermath of an assassination is a masterclass in controlled confusion. Inside the pantry of the Ambassador Hotel, blood pooled on the concrete, flashbulbs blinded the terrified witnesses, and the LAPD rapidly established a perimeter. The authorities had their man. Sirhan Sirhan was in handcuffs. The smoking 8-shot revolver was secured in an evidence bag, and the narrative was already being broadcast across the global wire services. A lone, politically motivated fanatic had struck again. But while the intelligence apparatus relies on the malleability of human memory and the chaos of a crowded room to sell a lie, they cannot negotiate with the rigid, unforgiving laws of physics. The deep state had successfully orchestrated the execution, but they were about to encounter an incorruptible adversary on the cold steel of the autopsy table. His name was Dr. Thomas Noguchi, the chief medical examiner for Los Angeles County. Noguchi was a man who worshipped at the altar of forensic science. He did not care about CIA profiles, LAPD press briefings, or the political convenience of a lone gunman theory. He cared only about what the flesh, the bone, and the trajectory of the lead could tell him. When Robert Kennedy's body was brought into the morgue, Noguchi performed one of the most exhaustive, meticulously documented autopsies in American history. He knew the eyes of the world and the shadow of the Warren Commission's failures in Dallas were directly upon him. He spent hours examining the trajectory of the bullets, the entry wounds, and the condition of the surrounding tissue. And what he found did not just contradict the official narrative, it physically obliterated it. Noguchi discovered that Robert Kennedy had been shot 3 times, with a 4th bullet passing harmlessly through his suit jacket. But it was the lethal shot, the bullet that entered the senator's brain, that shattered the state's carefully constructed illusion. The fatal bullet struck Kennedy directly behind the right ear, traveling in an upward-forward angle into the skull. But the trajectory was only half the problem. When a firearm is discharged, it expels a cloud of burning gunpowder and superheated gases along with the bullet. If the muzzle is held close to the target, these burning particles embed themselves deep into the victim's skin, creating a distinct forensic signature known as tattooing or stippling. Noguchi found dense, concentrated powder burns deeply embedded in the skin behind Kennedy's right ear and on the fabric of his hair. Through rigorous test firing using the exact same caliber of weapon and identical ammunition, Noguchi established an irrefutable scientific fact. To produce that specific pattern of powder burns, the muzzle of the gun had to be positioned at a distance of precisely 1 inch, no more than 2.5 centimeters, from the back of Robert Kennedy's head. This was a mathematical and geographical impossibility within the LAPD's narrative. Sirhan was pinned against a stainless steel serving table at the front of the room. Dozens of eyewitnesses, including trained observers, journalists, and athletes, placed Sirhan squarely in front of Kennedy. Even as Kennedy turned his head to shake hands with the kitchen staff, the closest Sirhan ever got to the senator was an estimated 3 to 6 feet. Furthermore, Sirhan's weapon was grabbed and forced away from Kennedy almost immediately by the men who tackled him. At no point in the timeline, from any physical angle, was Sirhan 1 inch behind Robert Kennedy's right ear. Flesh does not lie. Ballistics do not lie. The forensic evidence demanded the presence of a second gunman, but the powder burns were only the beginning of the mathematical nightmare facing the conspirators. The Iver Johnson .22 caliber revolver recovered from Sirhan held a maximum capacity of 8 rounds. He was tackled instantly and never had the opportunity to reload. Yet, the physical inventory of the damage inside the pantry told a completely different story. Let us do the math that the LAPD refused to do. Robert Kennedy was struck by 3 bullets, and a 4th passed through his clothing. That accounts for 4 rounds. Paul Schrade, a Union official walking behind Kennedy, was shot in the head. Ira Goldstein, a young campaign volunteer, was shot twice. William Weisel, an ABC News producer, was shot in the abdomen. Erwin Stroll, a teenager, was shot in the leg. Elizabeth Evans, a campaign worker, was shot in the head. That is a total of 10 bullets that struck human flesh and clothing. Furthermore, crime scene photographs and initial police reports clearly documented multiple additional bullet holes embedded in the wooden door frames and the acoustic ceiling panels of the pantry. Independent acoustic analyses of recordings from that night, though highly debated, have led some researchers to place the total number of discharge rounds at 12 or 13. If a gun that holds 8 bullets fired 13 times, it breaks the most elementary arithmetic, presenting an existential threat to the official narrative. The extra bullets and the powder burns confirmed that Sirhan was exactly what the MK Ultra profile suggested. A highly visible, noisy distraction firing wildly into the crowd, drawing every eye and every camera. But while the crowd wrestled with the decoy, the true assassin executed the mission. Who was standing 1 inch behind Robert Kennedy's right shoulder? For decades, independent researchers have pointed to the spatial geometry of the fatal funnel, focusing their suspicion on the private security guard, Thane Eugene Caesar. Caesar, an outspoken right-wing extremist who harbored a visceral hatred for the Kennedys, was employed by Ace Guard Service, a company with deep ties to the local aerospace and defense contractors that RFK threatened to defund. As Kennedy moved through the cramped pantry, Caesar was physically gripping Kennedy's right arm, supposedly guiding him. He was positioned exactly in the blind spot behind the senator's right ear. In later interviews, Caesar admitted that he drew his own weapon during the chaos, claiming it was a .38 caliber, though colleagues testified he also owned a .22, the exact caliber used to kill Kennedy. Caesar claimed he was knocked down and never fired, but eyewitnesses reported seeing a security guard with his gun drawn, pointing directly at Kennedy's back, firing amidst the confusion. The acoustic environment of the pantry provided the perfect cover for a synchronized kill. A .22 caliber pistol does not produce a booming roar. It produces a sharp pop. In a room echoing with screams, breaking glass, and the rapid fire of Sirhan's revolver, a second .22 being fired from point-blank range into a human body would be almost entirely muffled. The professional assassin used the deafening noise of the decoy as an acoustic shadow, slipping the muzzle right up to the back of the target's head and pulling the trigger before melting away into the panicked crowd. Dr. Thomas Noguchi formalized his findings in the official autopsy report. He laid out the trajectory, the muzzle distance, and the powder burns with uncompromising clinical precision. He handed the LAPD the definitive proof of a conspiracy. The police now had a choice. They could follow the science, hunt down the second gunman, and expose the most sophisticated assassination plot in American history. Or they could protect the system, bury the evidence, and destroy the career of the man who dared to document the truth. The establishment does not tolerate those who expose its mechanisms of control. The decision was made instantly. The murder was over, but the cover-up, a brazen systemic campaign of evidentiary destruction, was about to begin. The doors of the Los Angeles County morgue swung shut, sealing Dr. Thomas Noguchi and his explosive forensic findings inside. Outside, the machinery of the state was already pivoting from the execution of the target to the management of the aftermath. The assassination of a prominent political figure creates a highly volatile vacuum. Nature abhors a vacuum, but the deep state relies on it. Within hours of Robert Kennedy's death, the Los Angeles Police Department formed a highly compartmentalized, elite task force to handle the investigation. They called it Special Unit Senator, or SUS. To the grieving American public, the formation of SUS sounded like a commitment to absolute justice. In reality, it was a firewall. It was a containment operation designed to corral the sprawling, messy, contradictory evidence of a conspiracy and ruthlessly compress it into the narrow, pre-approved parameters of the lone gunman theory. To understand the sheer audacity of the cover-up, one must look at the architects of Special Unit Senator. The investigation was not handed to standard homicide detectives who follow the evidence wherever it leads. It was placed under the operational control of men with deeply entrenched backgrounds in intelligence and psychological warfare. Key figures within SUS had documented histories of working alongside federal intelligence agencies, particularly in South America, executing covert operations and counterinsurgency training. They were not detectives, they were operatives. Their mission was not to solve a murder. Their mission was to build a legal and public relations fortress around Sirhan, ensuring that no other suspect, no other bullet, and no other motive could ever penetrate the official narrative. The first objective of SUS was the systematic eradication of physical anomalies. The kitchen pantry of the Ambassador Hotel was a forensic nightmare for the lone gunman theory. Bullet holes were scattered across the acoustic ceiling tiles and embedded in the wooden door frames, physical proof of the extra rounds fired by the second assassin. These tiles and frames were initially removed by crime scene investigators and logged into evidence. They were photographed, diagrammed, and cataloged. But as Dr. Noguchi's autopsy report confirmed that Kennedy was shot from behind at point-blank range, those ceiling tiles transformed from standard evidence into radioactive proof of a coup. The LAPD's response was breathtaking in its brazenness. Before the trial of Sirhan Sirhan had even concluded, the police department ordered the physical destruction of the ceiling panels and the door frames. They were not misplaced in a warehouse. They were not accidentally lost. They were intentionally loaded into an incinerator and burned to ash. Furthermore, thousands of crime scene photographs, visual records that could have mapped the exact positions of Thane Eugene Caesar, the secondary shooters, and the fleeing handlers were officially classified as destroyed or missing. The state did not merely hide the evidence, they cremated it. They did this with the profound, chilling arrogance of an institution that knows it will never be held accountable, because it is the institution that controls the mechanisms of accountability. But destroying physical evidence is only half the battle. The most unpredictable variable in any cover-up is human memory. The pantry had been packed with witnesses, and in the immediate unscripted aftermath of the shooting, several individuals saw the raw, unedited truth. They saw a conspiracy in motion. The most dangerous witness to the deep state was a young campaign worker named Sandra Serrano. Serrano had stepped outside onto a fire escape for fresh air just moments before the shooting. In the immediate aftermath of the gunfire, she reported seeing a young woman in a white dress with black polka dots, accompanied by a young man, running frantically down the fire escape away from the pantry. According to Serrano, the woman in the polka dot dress was smiling, practically vibrating with adrenaline, and shouted, "We shot him! We shot him!" When Serrano asked who they had shot, the woman replied, "We shot Senator Kennedy," before vanishing into the Los Angeles night. Serrano's account was not an isolated hallucination. Multiple independent witnesses, both inside the pantry and outside the hotel, reported seeing the identical woman in the polka dot dress standing intimately close to Sirhan Sirhan just moments before the gunfire. In the context of MKUltra and trauma-based mind control, this woman fits the exact profile of a handler. A programmed asset like Sirhan requires a trigger, a specific visual or auditory cue delivered by a familiar handler to activate the hypnotic command and initiate the violent sequence. The woman in the polka dot dress was the key to unlocking the Manchurian Candidate. She was the tether connecting the disposable puppet to the invisible puppeteers. Because Serrano's testimony threatened to unravel the entire operation, SUS deployed a masterclass in psychological demolition to break her. She was subjected to a grueling, hostile polygraph examination administered by Hank Hernandez, a man who, like others in SUS, possessed an extensive background in military intelligence and interrogations. Hernandez did not question Serrano. He interrogated her as if she were an enemy combatant. The audio recordings of this session are a horrifying testament to state-sponsored psychological abuse. For hours, Hernandez aggressively bullied, demeaned, and manipulated the exhausted young woman. He accused her of seeking attention, of being hysterical, of failing the polygraph machine, a machine he controlled. He relentlessly battered her psychological defenses until, weeping and utterly broken, she conceded that she might have imagined the entire encounter. The system did not just silence her, it weaponized her own self-doubt to invalidate her reality. This is the true brutality of the system. It does not merely kill the target, it murders the truth by systematically destroying the minds of anyone who dares to speak it. Dozens of other witnesses who saw the extra guns, the fleeing suspects, or the impossible trajectories were subjected to similar campaigns of intimidation, coercion, and forced retraction. By the time the trial of Sirhan commenced in early 1969, the courtroom had been entirely sanitized. A trial is supposed to be an adversarial arena where the prosecution and the defense clash to unearth the truth. But the trial of Sirhan was a carefully choreographed stage play. His lead defense attorney, Grant Cooper, was a highly respected lawyer who had conveniently just been compromised by a federal indictment in an unrelated, highly publicized scandal. Facing his own potential ruin, Cooper did not mount a vigorous defense. He did not challenge the ballistics. He did not subpoena the destroyed ceiling tiles. He did not call the witnesses who saw the girl in the polka dot dress. Most devastatingly, he essentially stipulated to his client's guilt from the opening statements. He actively collaborated with the prosecution to suppress the explosive testimony of Dr. Thomas Noguchi. When Noguchi took the stand to explain the point-blank back-of-the-head trajectory, the evidence that definitively proved Sirhan could not have fired the fatal shot, both the prosecution and the defense rushed to minimize and dismiss his findings. Noguchi was subsequently subjected to a vicious smear campaign, temporarily fired from his position, and labeled unstable by the very political apparatus he was trying to serve. As Sirhan sat in the courtroom, he was a ghost haunting his own life. He listened to the witnesses, the prosecutors, and his own lawyers describe a murder he possessed no memory of committing. He exhibited wild, erratic mood swings, one moment sitting in a catatonic stupor, the next erupting in explosive, self-sabotaging rage, demanding to plead guilty and be sent to the gas chamber. To the untrained eye, he looked like a volatile psychopath. To experts in dissociative identity disorder and hypnotic programming, he looked like a mind violently fracturing under the stress of a reality it could not comprehend. His programming held firm. The amnesic barriers constructed in the dark rooms of the MK Ultra project withstood the pressure of a capital murder trial. He was convicted and sentenced to death, a sentence later commuted to life in prison. The gavel fell. The file was closed. The official history was written. The deep state had executed a flawless containment strategy. They had successfully navigated the most dangerous phase of the assassination, the public scrutiny of the legal system, by controlling both sides of the courtroom and incinerating the physical reality of the crime scene. Robert Kennedy was buried beside his brother in Arlington National Cemetery. With the earth packed over his grave, the ultimate threat to the military-industrial complex was neutralized. The Vietnam War raged on for another 7 years, generating immeasurable wealth for the defense sector while slaughtering millions. The investigations into the assassination of John F. Kennedy were permanently sealed in the vault of conspiracy theories, dismissed by a compliant media. The trauma of the Kennedy family became a national spectacle, a tragic American myth, rather than what it truly was, the result of a systematic, blood-soaked purge of a political dynasty that had dared to turn against the machine that built it. The 6th of June 1968 did not merely mark the death of a senator. It marked the physiological death of the American spring. When the television networks broadcast the solemn black and white footage of Robert F. Kennedy's casket being loaded onto the funeral train, the deep state did not mourn. They exhaled. The assassination was a surgical strike, but its true target was not a single man. The target was the psychological infrastructure of the American electorate. To understand the ruthlessness of the system, you must understand its primary vulnerability: hope. Hope is the most dangerous contagion to an entrenched power structure. When a population believes that the system can be reformed from within, they mobilize, they vote, and they demand accountability. By murdering John F. Kennedy, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King Jr., and finally Robert F. Kennedy in the span of 5 years, the establishment executed a psychological operation of unprecedented scale. They did not just eliminate the leaders, they weaponized grief. They conditioned the American public to subconsciously accept a chilling, unspoken social contract. Anyone who attempts to fundamentally alter the military-industrial complex or the banking syndicate will be slaughtered in broad daylight, and there is absolutely nothing you can do about it. The immediate macro-political dividends of RFK's death were staggering. With the anti-war, anti-establishment coalition left leaderless and shattered, the system seamlessly installed Richard Nixon. The Vietnam War, which Robert Kennedy had vowed to terminate, was deliberately prolonged for another 7 agonizing years. This was not a failure of diplomacy. It was a triumphant return on investment. The defense contractors, the aerospace engineers, and the chemical companies manufacturing napalm and Agent Orange reaped billions of dollars in federal contracts. The prolonged conflict in the jungles of Southeast Asia generated immense, unprecedented profits for the defense sector tightly linked to Wall Street. The system is entirely immoral. It does not view human life as a sacred entity. It views human life as a consumable resource, a variable in a geopolitical algorithm designed to maximize profit and consolidate control. Robert Kennedy had threatened to unplug that machine. His execution was, from the perspective of the deep state, simply a necessary administrative adjustment to maintain the operational flow of capital. But while the architects of the assassination moved on to harvest the profits of the Cold War, they left behind a living, breathing piece of evidence. Sirhan Sirhan was locked in a cage, isolated in the maximum security wing of the California penal system. If you want to witness the true, unvarnished cruelty of the state, you do not look at the murder. You look at the aftermath. For decades, Sirhan has been dragged before parole boards. The ritual is always the same. The board demands that he show remorse, that he take responsibility, and that he apologize for the premeditated murder of Robert Kennedy. And every single time, Sirhan offers the same agonizing, bewildered response. He cannot apologize for a crime he possesses absolutely no memory of committing. The parole board interprets this as sociopathic defiance, but independent psychological experts recognize it as the tragic, enduring architecture of trauma-based mind control. The state is demanding that a broken puppet apologize for the strings that pulled him. It is a form of ongoing psychological torture. Sirhan is not just a prisoner. He is a vault. His brain contains the encrypted blueprints of the MK Ultra program. For years, the establishment fiercely blocked any attempt by independent psychiatrists to conduct deep hypnotic regression on Sirhan. They claimed it was a manipulation of the legal process. In reality, they were terrified of what the vault might reveal if the right combination was found. It was not until the late 2000s and 2010s that a Harvard medical school professor and foremost expert in trauma and hypnosis, Dr. Daniel Brown, was finally granted extensive access to Sirhan. Dr. Brown spent over 60 hours conducting clinical hypnotic interviews with the prisoner. What he uncovered was not a political extremist, but a textbook victim of coercive hypnoprogramming. Under deep hypnosis, Sirhan's amnesic barriers began to crack. He did not recall shooting Robert Kennedy. Instead, he vividly recalled being at a firing range. He recalled the visual cue of a circular target. More chillingly, he recalled the sensory trigger, a young woman in a polka dot dress who lightly pinched him on the shoulder, a standard physical anchor used in covert programming to initiate an altered state. Dr. Brown mapped out the precise mechanism of the Manchurian Candidate. Sirhan had been programmed to enter range mode upon receiving the visual and tactile triggers. When the woman in the pantry pinched his shoulder and stepped back, Sirhan's conscious mind essentially shut off. He was not in a crowded hotel kitchen. In his programmed reality, he was back at the firing range shooting at a paper target. He was a biological drone executing a pre-installed subroutine. This is why his eyes were blank. This is why his pulse was steady. This is why he fired his weapon mechanically until it was empty, completely oblivious to the athletes tackling him to the floor. Dr. Brown concluded with absolute clinical certainty that Sirhan was a programmed decoy who did not possess the conscious intent to kill. When Dr. Brown and Sirhan's legal team presented this explosive, scientifically corroborated evidence to the California courts, demanding a new trial or an evidentiary hearing, the response of the judicial system was a masterclass in institutional stonewalling. The courts refused to hear the evidence. They dismissed the findings as speculative. They applied procedural roadblocks, citing the expiration of statutes of limitations and the finality of the original conviction. The legal system operates under the illusion of seeking the truth, but its actual function is the preservation of order and the protection of the state's foundational narratives. To admit that Sirhan was hypno-programmed by a rogue intelligence apparatus would require the United States government to admit that it actively operates black projects to assassinate its own political leaders. It would require the invalidation of 50 years of history. The system will burn the world to the ground before it allows that thread to be pulled. Therefore, Sirhan remains in a cage, a living casualty of a war he does not remember fighting. But the cover-up required more than just the imprisonment of the decoy. It required the systematic attrition of the truth seekers. Over the decades, those who were inside the pantry and knew the official story was a fabrication were subjected to relentless marginalization. Consider the case of Paul Schrade. Schrade was a prominent Union leader, a close friend of Robert Kennedy, and one of the men walking directly behind the senator in the pantry. During the shooting, Schrade was struck in the head by one of the bullets. He survived, but instead of accepting the LAPD's narrative, Schrade dedicated the rest of his life to investigating the assassination. He reviewed the autopsy. He read the ballistics reports. He realized the mathematical impossibility of Sirhan firing 13 shots from an 8-shot revolver. Schrade became the most dangerous type of witness, a victim who refused to be silent. He spent decades publicly demanding that the LAPD reopen the case. He even appeared at Sirhan's parole hearings, not to condemn the man who allegedly shot him, but to advocate for his release, stating on the public record that Sirhan was innocent of the fatal shot and that the true assassin escaped. How did the establishment respond to a bleeding victim pointing at a second shooter? They ignored him. The mainstream media, heavily consolidated and heavily influenced by intelligence agency liaisons, branded Schrade a fringe conspiracy theorist. They treated a man with a bullet wound in his skull as if he were a delusional crank. This is the sophisticated brutality of the modern cover-up. The deep state no longer needs to physically assassinate every witness. They simply assassinate their credibility. They weaponize the term conspiracy theory, a phrase historically promoted by the CIA specifically to discredit critics of the Warren Commission, to intellectually quarantine anyone who questions the structural integrity of the official lie. The LAPD's role in this ongoing suppression is a study in bureaucratic complicity. When audio experts later analyzed a forgotten dictabelt recording made by a freelance journalist in the Ambassador Ballroom, they discovered the acoustic signatures of the gunfire. Modern forensic audio analysis, utilizing technology that did not exist in 1968, identified the distinct impulse waves of at least 13 shots fired at a pace that was physically impossible for a single human finger to pull a trigger on a single revolver. The audio clearly indicated two weapons firing almost simultaneously. When this acoustic proof was presented to the authorities, the LAPD did not flinch. They simply refused to engage. They locked the physical evidence vault. They classified remaining files. The police department acts as the janitorial staff for the deep state, sweeping the anomalies under the rug of classified national security. The assassination of Robert F. Kennedy was not the end of an era. It was the blueprint for the future. The events of June 1968 served as a highly successful proof of concept for the invisible government. They learned that they could execute a popular anti-establishment leader in a room filled with 70 people, capture a brainwashed patsy, destroy the forensic evidence in plain sight, and the American public would eventually swallow the lie and go back to work. The system evolved. It learned that physical assassination, while effective, is messy and leaves forensic footprints. In the decades that followed, the deep state refined its methodology. The operations became bloodless but equally lethal. Today, if a political figure genuinely threatens the military-industrial complex, the banking syndicates, or the intelligence apparatus, they do not need to be lured into a kitchen pantry. They are lured into the fatal funnel of the digital landscape. The intelligence community, working in seamless symbiosis with corporate media and tech conglomerates, executes character assassinations. They manufacture scandals, they weaponize the justice system, they deplatform, and they financially ruin the target. The MK Ultra programming has evolved from individuals in black sites to the mass psychological conditioning of the entire population through algorithmic manipulation and screen addiction. In many ways, the modern public has become susceptible to a new form of mass conditioning, triggered by digital cues to outrage, division, and apathy, often unaware of the algorithms dictating their consumption. The tragedy of Robert Kennedy's death is not just that a good man was murdered. The tragedy is that the coup was completely, utterly successful. When the bullets tore through his brain, they severed the final nerve connecting the American government to the American people. We do not live in a republic. We live in a managed corporate oligarchy, operating behind the holographic projection of democracy. The votes you cast are merely suggestion boxes placed outside the heavily guarded boardroom of the deep state. The men who orchestrated the events in the Ambassador Hotel won the war. They own the banks, they own the media, they own the defense contracts, and they own the history books. When you look back at the x-rays, at the shattered skull, at the 1-inch powder burns that the system tried to incinerate, you're not just looking at forensic evidence. You are looking at the foundational architecture of modern power. You are looking at the price of truth in an empire built on lies. To truly grasp the magnitude of the 1968 assassination, you must understand its ultimate objective. The deep state did not just want to stop a single political campaign. They executed a targeted warning to any future leader who might dare to challenge the military intelligence syndicate. The relentless gaslighting surrounding this case fundamentally broke the psychological spirit of an entire generation, replacing the idealism of the 1960s with enduring political apathy. The kitchen pantry of the Ambassador Hotel strips away the comforting illusion of a functional democracy. It leaves us with the stark, unvarnished truth. The system does not need to hide in the shadows. They can capture a programmed puppet, ignore the physical presence of a second gun, destroy the forensic evidence in plain sight, and force the judicial system to look the other way. True power does not reside in the ballot box. It resides in the hands of those who control the narrative. Case closed.